No engine, no gunpowder, no metal spring, just timber, rope, stone, and gravity. A completed trebuchet could throw a heavy projectile across a battlefield and strike walls that had stopped armies for generations, but a falling weight this destructive was also a threat to itself. Weak beams could split. Ropes could fail. The arm could snap loose. The counterweight could tear the structure apart if the machine was badly built. And yet it worked. To understand why, you have to start with the one thing it was built to destroy. A medieval fortress wall was more than a backdrop to siege. It was a deliberate, layered obstacle, an engineered opponent built to absorb shock and outlast any assault. At its core, the wall stood as a monolith, two faces of carefully cut ashlar stone, smooth and tightly set, sandwiching a thick core of rubble and lime mortar. Typical curtain walls stretched 1.5 to 3 meters thick, with heights from 10 to 20 meters, enough mass to swallow the force of ladders, rams, and any weapon that relied on brute strength alone. Every feature was calculated for defense. Arrow slits, sometimes barely a hand's width, let archers fire from safety. Battlements and parapets gave cover, while machicolations allowed defenders to drop stones or boiling oil on attackers below. At the base, a sloped talus deflected falling projectiles and made scaling even harder. Surrounding ditches or moats forced siege engines to keep their distance, turning the open ground into a killing zone. The real challenge wasn't just breaking stone, it was making it fail, shot after shot, under repeated impact. The outer ashlar could chip or spall, but the rubble core absorbed shock and kept the wall standing. Even a breach in the face didn't guarantee collapse. Defenders could patch holes with timber and rubble, buying time with every repair. The wall's bulk was its greatest strength, designed to turn every attack into a contest of endurance and force. For centuries, these defenses set the standard for what an army had to overcome. Any machine built to bring them down had to deliver not just a single blow, but repeated, focused violence, striking harder and from farther away than any earlier weapon could reach. Every traditional assault tool forced attackers into the deadliest ground. Ladders demanded that men run straight to the base of the wall, exposed to arrows, stones, and boiling oil. Even the bravest could only climb as fast as timber would bear, while defenders waited above, ready to push or burn the rungs. Battering rams, built to smash wooden gates, failed against thick stone. Their heavy beams, swung by teams under a canopy of shields, delivered impact, but not enough. The stone barely chipped. Most rams shattered themselves before the wall gave way. Torsion-powered engines, like ballistae and onagers, could throw stones or bolts from a safer distance, but their projectiles were too light for the new masonry. A 20-kilogram stone, flung by twisted sinew or hair, might batter a wall's face, but it could not break through meters of ashlar and rubble. The physics was simple. The wall's mass swallowed the blow. To do real damage, a weapon had to deliver not just speed, but weight, and do it from beyond the reach of defending archers. Siege warfare began to shift away from direct contact. The problem was not just to touch the wall, but to strike it hard, again and again, from a position of safety. The need was clear. A machine that could hurl massive stones over parapets, across moats, and into the heart of the fortification without exposing its crew to certain death. The answer would not come from more muscle or sharper steel, but from a new approach to force, storing energy high in the air, releasing it in a single, devastating swing, and repeating the process until the strongest wall began to fail. A trebuchet begins as a puzzle in timber. Before a single stone can be hurled, every beam must be chosen, cut, and joined to hold still while the rest of the machine moves with violent force. Builders favored seasoned oak or fir, dense, predictable hardwoods that could take a pounding without splitting. These timbers were left to air dry for years, losing moisture so they would not warp or crack when the counterweight dropped. The main frame sat on a broad, earth-filled crib dug into the ground. Packed soil and stacked beams formed a low center of gravity, anchoring the whole structure against the shock of launch. If the base shifted, the machine could tip or tear itself apart on the first shot. Every joint mattered. Mortise and tenon joinery locked the main beams together, with dovetails and wooden wedges driven tight to resist pull-out forces. At the highest stress points, the pivot and the junctions where the arm met the frame, iron straps and bolts wrapped the wood, holding it fast against twisting and splitting. These reinforcements were not just for show. When the counterweight fell, the sudden load could shear through a weak joint or snap a poorly cut tenon. Modern reconstructions have shown that a single flaw, an under-seasoned beam, a loose mortise, or a missing iron band can lead to catastrophic failure. The arm might break free, the axle could split, or the entire frame might collapse in a cascade of shattered wood and ruined rope. The anonymous specialists who built these engines worked under pressure, their skill measured not in elegance, but in survival. The trebuchet's first purpose was to endure its own forces. Only when the frame could stand unmoved, absorbing shock, holding shape, and refusing to twist or buckle, could it become a weapon? Until then, it was carpentry under siege, a structure built to resist the violence it would soon unleash. The heart of the trebuchet is its arm, a massive lever that transforms a falling weight into violent, controlled motion. At the axle, a short arm and a long arm do entirely different jobs. The short arm, thick and compact, takes the brunt of the counterweight's force. The long arm, slender and extended, is built for speed and reach. When the counterweight drops, its mass pulls the short arm downward. The pivot, usually a reinforced wooden axle, sometimes banded with iron, becomes the fulcrum where gravity is redirected into acceleration. Every bit of energy from the falling weight is forced through this narrow point. This is where raw carpentry turns into physics. The arm's geometry decides everything: how much leverage the machine has, how fast the tip travels, and how much stress the axle must survive. Typical medieval designs favored a ratio between 4:1 and 6:1, meaning the long arm was 4 to 6 times longer than the short. Modern reconstructions, chasing maximum range, often settle closer to 3:1. This balance lets the counterweight fall far enough to store energy, while the long arm swings fast enough to hurl a stone over the highest wall. But all this motion comes at a price. The axle and pivot are under constant threat. If the short arm is too short, the counterweight can strike the ground or frame. If the pivot is not high enough, the arm can jam or split. Axle. Stress peaks at the moment of release, when the entire force of the falling weight tries to wrench the arm from its housing. Builders reinforce these points with iron and extra timber, knowing that a failure here could send the arm flying or tear the machine apart. In the trebuchet, leverage is not just a concept, it is a force you can feel in every creak of the timber and every shudder of the frame. A trebuchet's power begins with the counterweight, an unremarkable box filled with stone, lead, or sand, but built to hold a mass that defies easy handling. This is not a decorative feature. The counterweight is the machine's engine, storing energy not in springs or twisted ropes, but in the simple fact of height. Every time the box is raised by capstan and rope, it becomes a reservoir of potential, loaded with the force of gravity itself. The higher it climbs, the more energy it holds, waiting for the moment of release. Inside the box, the fill must be dense and stable. Stones are packed tight, sometimes layered with sand or lead to prevent shifting. If the mass moves unpredictably, or if the box breaks, the force becomes chaos, enough to snap an arm or tear the frame apart. Medieval builders learned to reinforce every seam with iron bands, locking the cargo in place. Only then could the weight be trusted to fall straight and true. The numbers are staggering. Modern reconstructions have used counterweights weighing up to 22 tons, enough to crush a wagon flat. Raising such a load is slow, methodical work, demanding teams of men at the capstans. Each turn of the rope strains the frame and tightens every joint. Once the counterweight reaches the peak of its arc, the entire machine is primed. The frame groans under the load. The arm stands poised, held in check by a single pin. All of the violence to come is already present, silent and invisible, stored in the height of the box. There is no magic here, only gravity, waiting to be unleashed. The moment the pin is pulled, tons of mass drop in an instant. The arm whips upward, the sling flashes out, and the energy that took hours to store is spent in a single, violent motion. This is the heart of the trebuchet, a falling weight, a rotating arm, and the brutal logic of stored gravity turned into destruction. The sling is the trebuchet's most precise and unforgiving component, a length of rope and a pouch, yet it transforms brute force into a controlled strike. Fixed near the tip of the long arm, the sling adds reach beyond the timber itself, extending the arc and multiplying the speed of the projectile. Typical sling lengths on large machines fall between 1.2 and 1.5 meters, measured from the arm's end to the cradle that cradles the stone. This extra length is not a convenience. It is the difference between a stone that drops short and one that clears the wall. At the heart of the mechanism sits the release pin, a small metal hook or clevis set at the arm's tip. The angle of this pin, bent up or down by a few degrees, controls when the sling lets go. As the arm whips upward, the sling trails behind, tightening until the moment its loop slips free. Release comes at roughly 45 degrees above the horizontal, but the margin for error is razor thin. A pin set too high or too low, or a sling even slightly too long, sends the stone tumbling or firing straight into the ground. Modern tests show that a timing error of just 5 degrees can cut the machine's range by nearly a third. With the sling in play, the trebuchet becomes more than a lever. It is a system of moving parts, each depending on the last for perfect coordination. The moment of release is not just a question of force, but of timing, a dance of wood, rope, and gravity. A well-tuned sling throws a 120-kilogram stone in a smooth, arcing flight. A poorly set one wastes all the stored energy in a wild, dangerous misfire. Every shot is a test of precision, making the difference between a breach in the wall and a wasted day under siege. A trebuchet at rest is tension in waiting. Nothing moves until the crew moves in. 15 to 40 men, each with a practiced role, each aware that a single mistake could turn timber and rope into flying wreckage. Their first task is to raise the counterweight. Capstan bars are slotted into the drum, and men lean in unison, backs bowed, boots digging into the earth. The ropes groan as tons of stone or lead are lifted, inch by inch, to the apex. Every turn of the capstan stores more potential, forcing the frame to creak and the ground to settle under the load. The arm, now locked in its upright stance, is a lever wound tight with gravity. At the tip, the sling is attached, pouch open, waiting for the projectile. A stone, sometimes 120 kilograms or more, is placed in the cradle. The release pin is checked. The crew clears the swing path, stepping well back from the arc of the arm. No one lingers near the ropes or the axle. Even a stray hand at the wrong moment could end in disaster. Discipline is not ceremony, it is survival. The launch sequence is as much about safety as it is about force. A misaligned pin, a frayed rope, a hurried call, any of these can turn the machine against its own builders. Modern reconstructions have snapped axles and thrown splinters when the wood was green or the iron bands loose. Ropes have parted without warning, sending the counterweight crashing down uncontrolled. The violence stored in the raised mass does not care who stands in its path. The order is given. The pin is pulled. In a heartbeat, the counterweight drops, the short arm plunges, and the long arm whips upward. The sling tightens, the stone lifts, and at just the right angle, the loop slips free. All the tension, all the careful preparation is released in a single, deafening moment. The crew stands clear, eyes on the stone as it arcs toward the wall. Then, just as quickly, they return to their posts, ready to reset, reload, and repeat the cycle. Every shot is a test of timber, rope, and discipline, a contest not only with the wall, but with the machine itself. A stone weighing over 100 kilograms slams into the face of a medieval wall. The moment of impact is sudden and violent. Cracks radiate outward from the strike, slicing through ashlar and mortar. Chunks of stone break away in a spray of dust, while a cone-shaped zone of crushed material forms beneath the surface. This is not a clean hole, but a web of fractures, spalling, splintering, and prying the wall apart from within. The first shot rarely brings down the structure, but each strike leaves a scar. The outer skin weakens, the rubble core shifts, and tension builds in the masonry. The real power of the trebuchet is not in a single blow, but in repetition. Each projectile lands with the force of gravity unleashed, hammering the same spot again and again. The wall absorbs the shock at first, but cracks grow with every hit. Mortar loosens, stones shift, and the breach widens. Over time, the cone of damage deepens, spreading instability through the core. Defenders patch holes with timber and rubble, but the process is relentless. Where battering rams failed to make a dent, the trebuchet's repeated violence breaks the wall's will to stand. At the height of this technology stood the Warwolf, the largest counterweight trebuchet ever built. Commissioned by Edward I during the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, the Warwolf was engineered for maximum impact. Its arm, towering nearly 90 meters when fully extended, hurled stones weighing 120 kilograms over distances exceeding 200 meters. Chronicles claim a single shot pierced 2 curtain walls, likening the stone's passage to an arrow through cloth. The psychological effect was as real as the physical one. Defenders watched as their strongest barriers splintered under the weight of falling stone. Modern reconstructions confirm what the chronicles describe. Experimental archaeologists have built full-scale trebuchets, loaded them with tons of counterweight, and fired at masonry targets. The results are consistent. Repeated impacts produce the same cone of crushed stone, the same radial cracks, the same gradual collapse seen in medieval accounts. Even when design details vary, different arm ratios, sling lengths, or counterweight masses, the principle holds. The machine's effectiveness comes not from secret knowledge, but from the predictable, brutal logic of mechanics. Timber, rope, and stone arranged to turn gravity into destruction. Each shot is a test of engineering, and the wall's failure is a record of accumulated force, not a stroke of luck or legend. Today, gravity and leverage remain as relentless as stone and steel. Every engineered system, whether bridge, crane, or skyscraper, still answers to the same laws that hurled stones through fortress walls. When forces are misjudged, the failure is sudden and unforgiving. The trebuchet endures as a warning. True power is measured not by spectacle, but by control. The weight always falls. The question is, are we ready when it does?